I keep seeing posts like these ones floating around. Housing is a human right. Healthcare is a human right. Healthcare is a human right, full stop. Healthcare is a human right, not a privilege. Asylum is a human right. Yes, unconditional basic income is a human right. I assume he means universal. Climate justice is a human right. Contraception is a human right. Freedom of speech is a human right. Housing is a human right. Access to water is a human right. Migration is a human right. Good quality internet is a human right. Tampax is a human right. Not tampons, but that specific brand. Protesting is a human right. Basic income's a human right. Access to public toilets is a human right. Self-defense is a human right. Jesus. It seems like you can declare anything a human right nowadays, with no real argumentation behind any of it, especially on Twitter, where explaining your ideas in depth is discouraged by the very nature of the format. But what is a right? Well, I'm not exactly sure. It's been a long time since I read good old John Locke. But maybe we can formulate a decent idea of what a right is, just by using our own common sense. I'm not saying this is necessarily correct, just what seems reasonable to me. So you've got natural rights, right? You've heard of that phrase before. Well, from a layman's point of view, a natural right seems to be something you're born with. It's in nature. Here's a good way to conceptualize it. Imagine yourself on a deserted island with nobody else around. A natural right is anything that you can do in that situation. You have the right to speech, obviously. You can say whatever you like, unless you're mute or something, but the exception doesn't discount the rule. How about this? The mute person can draw letters in the sand or something. You have the right to articulate your statement. Do you have the right to water or food? No, but you have the right to go and get it. You can fish or hunt an animal, or collect plants to eat. We could call this something like the right to labor. You don't have the right to have a fish to eat, because if you did, the natural world would have a fish fall into your lap every time you were hungry. But you do have the right to go out and try to catch a fish using your own labor. To me, it would seem that natural rights include only the right to speak and the right to labor. And it seems that the right to labor includes most other possible actions. The right to gather food, to create clothing, to build a shelter, to defend yourself from an attacking animal. You have the right to do those things which you can do. You don't have the right to achieve a positive result from those actions, but you do have the right to try and reach that result. But all of this stuff is a result of living in isolation. When you add another person to the deserted island, a person who has the same rights as you, what do you do when your rights overlap? Well, you both have the right to speak. That hasn't changed. You don't have the right to be heard by the other person, but you do have the right to say anything you like. You still have the right to labor, but what stops the other guy from just rolling in and stealing that fish after you've caught it? Well, technically nothing. You can definitely live in a might makes right society, where there's no negotiation and only force. After all, the other person's efforts to steal your fish is still their labor that they have a right to. But it's also pretty clear why that behavior doesn't create a stable civilization. The alternative to this is what I guess we could call derived rights. A derived right is the compromise born out of a situation where the rights of two people conflict. The new right created from the compromise solves the conflict. So, for example, a derived right in the fish theft situation would be the right to the fruits of your labor. So not only do you have the right to labor, which would be the right to go out and get the fish, but you have the right to the produce of your labor, the right to own, keep, and eat the fish without having somebody walk up, club you on the back of the head, and take it from you. Derived rights are the source of all fruitful cooperation. So, two people can build a net, go fishing for a much larger haul than either of them could catch individually, and agree to split the fruits of their labor. But derived rights are also the source of individualism. Let's say we have 10 people on our little island, and one of them decides to craft himself an axe, chop down some trees Minecraft style, and build himself a shelter. The use of the shelter is the fruits of his labor, and since he has a right to the fruits of his labor, he's under no obligation to share his shelter with anyone else. He's probably going to be considered a dick by the others for not sharing, but the others don't have the right to his shelter, only a right to build and enjoy their own. This is the root of what we call property rights. It would seem to me that property rights are simply a more sophisticated form of the right to the fruits of your labor. In modern society, money allows us to defer collection of our labor's fruits to the future. Back on the island, when we go fishing and catch something, we get the fish immediately. But nowadays, a fisherman can fish, get paid for his labor, then 3 days later use that money to buy a fish. He probably wouldn't buy a fish, obviously, because he's a fisherman. He'd likely buy something else. So money also allows us to labor at a job, but generate the output of an entirely different job, using money to make the exchange. This is why communists are fundamentally wrong, by the way. Getting paid for your labor is not exploitation by the CEOs or whatever. It's simply allowing you to use your labor to get more stuff than what your job directly produces. And those CEOs with more money than you, well, they also perform more labor than you, whether that's from efficiency born out of experience or the quality or importance of the work. So no, communism does not give you the moral high ground for wanting to steal the rich's stuff just because you're not as rich as they are. But the derived right is not the only concept generated when you add a second person to the island. The other one is responsibility. When rights play out in reality, one person's right is everybody else's responsibility. So for example, you have two people on the island, and one person decides to say something. Because his speech is a right, the other person has a responsibility to not prevent him from speaking. If you had 10 people on the island and one was speaking, the other 9 have a responsibility to not prevent him from speaking. As always, he doesn't have the right to be heard. The other 9 can walk away, ignore him, counter with their own speech if they like, but they cannot silence him. When one person engages in labor, the other has a responsibility to not prevent him from doing so. They have no obligation to assist him or cooperate with him. They can even compete with him if they want, but they can't stop him from working. And when one person is enjoying the fruits of their labor, the others have a responsibility to not steal those fruits. This all sounds pretty good so far, right? I mean, if you own a house or a car, everybody else in your society has a responsibility to not damage it, steal it, or enter it without your approval. If you have money or objects, you have the right to own that stuff, and everybody else has a responsibility to leave it alone. And you also have those same responsibilities in regards to everybody else's stuff. And as we became more advanced, we began to derive more rights from our complex interactions. Freedom of religion, freedom of association, and freedom of the press are rights derived from the freedom of speech. The freedom to be alive, the freedom from slavery, are both derived from the freedom of labor. You can't work or enjoy the fruits of that work if you're dead or your property. As things became more complicated and we realized that a legal system was necessary to arbitrate between the many sets of overlapping rights we all share, we eventually realized that the functioning of such a system required the right to a fair trial and the right to legal counsel. These are also derived rights, obviously, and they're fundamentally necessary because we're fallible creatures dealing in concepts we still don't fully understand. I mean, yeah, if you and I are talking about being on an island, we can probably map out our overlapping rights and the resulting compromises pretty quickly. But can we draw that out for millions of people simultaneously? Probably not, that's a huge job. And it's one of the main reasons that we even have a court system. But let's get back to the original point of the video, all of those relatively new inventions people are calling rights. Let's see if they actually are rights. The most popular one was healthcare is a human right. Well, it's certainly a human need, nobody denies that. But does it meet the definition of a right? Well, let's go back to the island. Is it a natural right? Obviously not. Just like the natural world doesn't plop a fish into your lap just because you're hungry, it's also not going to plop a first aid kit there either. Is it a derived right, born out of the interactions between people? Well, maybe. But remember, when multiple people are involved, your rights are everybody else's responsibility. Speech is easy, just don't censor and you're fine. Property rights are also pretty easy, just don't steal. But how about a hypothetical right to being cared for? Remember, this is not a right to go and get healthcare, because that would be a right to the fruits of your labor. You work, you exchange your labor for healthcare, and you're good. This is directly the right to healthcare. That means everybody else has the responsibility to bring healthcare to you, regardless of and disconnected from your own labor. On our little island community, that might mean if one person is sick or injured, the other 9 people have a responsibility to care for them. Well, that seems fine so far. But because it's their right and your responsibility to fill it, you can't have an expectation of compensation. You don't get a reward for not censoring people, it's something that you just have to do. You don't get a reward for not stealing, same thing. And if healthcare were a human right, you don't get a reward for providing it. It's just your responsibility, one of the many you have to perform in order to live with other people. And this is where the objection to making healthcare a human right comes from. If healthcare is your human right, then it's everybody else's responsibility to fulfill, period. Now, if there's money in the budget and the doctor can get paid by the state for your care, then fine. But if there's no more money, one of 2 things happens. Either the government compels the doctor to care for you under the threat of force, because if he refuses to care for you, your rights are violated by his inaction regardless of his lack of compensation. Or the healthcare system collapses because it ends up becoming more profitable for doctors to go off and labor elsewhere under a different job, since that doctor not getting paid to care for you still needs to get paid somehow. In essence, the right to healthcare is incompatible with the right to the fruit of your own labor. Because when the chips are down, when the money's run out, people working in the health services are obligated to either work without reward or quit working. Same with the right to housing. Simply exchange doctor with carpenter, I guess, and you've got the same argument. If everybody's got the right to a house, not to buy one or build one, but to have one, then workers must labor under state compulsion to provide them, because failing to do so would be an abdication of their responsibility and a violation of other people's rights. This is again a major failure of communism. Communist states would use this justification to compel people to work, stating that the people had rights that needed fulfilling, and you had to fulfill them, regardless of whether you wanted to or not. People often say that abortion is a human right, and that's a giant can of worms I'm not prepared to get into in this video. But if, for the sake of argument, we accept that a woman has a right to seek an abortion, That does not give her the right to compel any individual doctor to give it to her. She doesn't have the right to an abortion, but the right to try and get one, like any other right derived from labor. And I say individual doctor because that's what it's ultimately all about, individuals. The healthcare system doesn't exist beyond the individuals who make it up. Races, nations, religions, organizations of all types, they don't exist beyond the individuals within them. We've only begun to create systems that exist independently of individuals just recently, with self-automated computers and things of that nature, but we're a long way off before that's relevant. All collectives are just individuals, and societies that recognize human rights do so because we recognize that the individual is the force that rejuvenates the collective. Every person has the potential to create or discover something and bring it back to the collective for everyone to enjoy. It's why every religious story is, at some point, about a single person in the wilderness, encountering the world itself, and then returning to the city with his new wisdom. It's why all of the most well-loved narratives, the shows, the movies, the books, follow the hero's journey of childhood, thrust into adventure, descent into darkness, and the victorious return to civilization. Human rights are a reflection of that knowledge, that we've figured out the individual is superordinate to the collective, despite the extreme importance of the collective, because it's the individual that keeps the collective alive. Every group that has squashed human rights did so in the name of the collective. Fascism does it in the name of the state, Nazism in the name of the race, communism in the name of the people or the worker, religions in the name of the believer, and they all inevitably collapse because the reforming force that would carry them into the future, the individual, is crushed along with his rights. A liberal society recognizes that my rights are everybody else's responsibility to uphold, and is therefore quite strict with what actually constitutes a right, so that nobody may have their own rights violated by their new responsibilities. The opportunity to go out and get healthcare, like any other labor, is absolutely a right. But healthcare itself cannot be a right. That doesn't mean that I'm against the idea of a national healthcare system. I think it's good for people to not just die because they can't afford the hospital stay. But it's still not a right, and just because you need it doesn't make it a right. A healthcare service is a privilege that a wealthy nation can provide its citizens, if and when the books are properly balanced. It's not a human right, and forcing it to be one will cause more problems than it will solve.